Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the Lunch and Learn series put on by the Chicago Asthma Consortium. Today's topic is on vaping and asthma. So welcome to our members, welcome guests as well. I'll say at the beginning, because we have just a couple of housekeeping items to go through before we get to the main event. Please mute your microphones and hide your videos. We won't be we won't need to speak or use your video for the presentation. So, if you do have questions and other sort of things you want to throw out there, you can put them in the chat. And no reason to raise hands or anything like that. My name is Matt Seymour. I'm the Executive Director of Mobile Care Chicago. I'm also the President of the Chicago Asthma Consortium. So on behalf of my fellow board members, I want to welcome you all today to this forum. And to give a brief schedule of how this is going to go, we'll do a welcome, which I'm doing right now. Then I'll introduce our speakers. We'll go through the formal presentation, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So we'll hold everybody's questions in the chat until we get to the end, and then we'll throw them all out to Rachel and Aaron. And then we'll close promptly at 12:30. So video and audio should be off, as I said before. For networking and communications, I'll ask you to just introduce yourself in the chat and say hello to the other attendees. If you have questions for presenters, you can also put those in the chat, and I'll be working as moderator to ensure that every question gets answered. And then we'll also have an evaluation at the end. So I hope that you'll stay on until the end of the presentation, and we'll be putting a link into the chat so that you can give us feedback and also let us know any other topics you'd like to hear discussed. If you're having technical difficulty, the best thing that you can do is contact Asher in the chat or using this email address right here. And if you just do a direct message to Asher, they'll be able to help you out. A little bit about CAC. Our mission is to improve the quality of life for people living with asthma through advocacy, education, and collaboration. And we do that by bringing together a number of different stakeholders throughout the city of Chicago and the more general Chicagoland area. So people who are medical providers, public health professionals, business leaders, government agencies, and community-based organizations, not to mention researchers in asthma and allergy, and people who are providing direct medical care, whether specific to asthma and allergies or through a primary care setting. If you want to learn more about our impact, you can go to our website, chicagoasthma.org. You can contribute or you can become a member and join us on any of the committees that are working throughout the year to try to advance good asthma education and guidelines-based care for people with asthma. In terms of volunteerism specifically, the committees that we have right now are the Community Advisory Board, which helps people who are doing research studies to frame ethical research projects and communicate them effectively to the community. We also have a Community Engagement Committee that does asthma education for people out in neighborhoods affected by high asthma prevalence. We have a fundraising committee, a membership committee, professional development, which is the committee that puts on forums like this one, and then a schools committee that interfaces directly with Chicago Public Schools and a number of other districts to advance policies that are to the benefit of people who have allergies and asthma. If you're interested in joining the board, we are accepting applications now. You can contact Asher either through the email address right here or through the chat. I'll also mention that on May 2nd, we're having an in-person conference at the American Lung Association's headquarters. We do have some limited seats available. You can register, and this is going to be on asthma and comorbidities. And it's the first time that we've had a conference on these topics in quite a while, so registration is going very quickly, but we do have some seats available. All right, and for today's presentation, we are joined by two individuals who I've had the pleasure of working with for a while now. Rachel Markunis is the Senior Program Manager at the Respiratory Health Association, where she oversees the Coordinated Asthma Care Program, which aims to increase asthma awareness and provide comprehensive care for children with asthma and COPD research and education. Her research and work interests are focused on addressing barriers to overall good health, particularly barriers to healthy lifestyle behaviors, such as healthy eating and physical activity. Erin Virgo is the program director at the Respiratory Health Association, where she currently leads the lung health program, lung health programming, including asthma management, tobacco cessation, COPD, and other educational content areas. Additionally, Erin is responsible for mentoring, grants management, strategic planning, and leading various multidisciplinary teams at RHA. It's wonderful to have both of these presenters here, especially for this topic. Thank you, Erin. And I'll turn it over to Rachel and Erin to get our presentation going.
Thank you, Matt, for that lovely introduction. Okay. So we're here to talk about vaping and asthma. I'm Erin. Rachel will take over after me, but I'll do a brief introduction about the Respiratory Health Association. I think a lot of you all know us already, but we were founded in 1906 as the Chicago Tuberculosis Institute. A couple name changes later. We are the Respiratory Health Association, and we focus in on tobacco cessation, asthma management, COPD, and other environmental policies. And so before we get started, and before we jump into like vaping and asthma, I wanted to first talk about some of the verbiage used and some of the definitions, because there's a lot of confusion. But I do want to preface this by saying like things are changing so quickly in this sort of topic that this slide might be obsolete in a year, or things might have different verbiage. So always be aware that things are constantly changing this. So what is vaping? Vaping is when you inhale an aerosol or a vapor into your lungs and exhale. It's like smoking a traditional cigarette, but with the use of a device called an electronic cigarette or e-cigarette. It's also known as an electronic nicotine delivery system, or ENDS for short. ENDS typically consists of a battery-powered heating element, a cartridge or pod that contains a liquid solution, and an atomizer that, when heated, converts the contents of the cartridge into an aerosol that the user then inhales. The liquid solution is also known as e-liquid or vape juice or e-juice even, and this is what contains the flavoring, the nicotine, and other chemicals. And vaping devices come in a couple different pod systems. There are many different types, so like pod vapes, which are an all-in-one system, which includes the battery, the vape products, and an atomizer. Pods can be disposable, refillable, whereas vape mods are modified vaping devices that give users more ability to customize their devices. And there are things called open systems and closed systems. And I'm not going to get into it, but like I said, there's a lot of different types of vaping products, a lot more on the horizon. So there's also a great deal of information you'll find on the internet, but I've noticed the best information is on sites that actually sell these products. So just be aware that when you go looking for descriptions of what this stuff is, they are also trying to sell you something. All right, so what are in e-liquids? Every brand has a unique combination of liquid solutions, often with the base ingredients of flavoring, nicotine, propylene glycol, and or vegetable glycerin. So some of these are used in everyday life. So propylene glycol, which is a food additive, but when you heat it up, It can generate formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen, and diacetyl, which is that artificial buttery flavoring that has been removed from like foods like popcorn from all additives because of health concerns. And the amounts of these components do vary based on desired outcomes of the user. So more vegetable glycerin creates more visible vapor, whereas the propylene glycol is a better carrier of flavor and nicotine than the vegetable glycerin. So here's the types of nicotines that e-cigarettes contain. So until recently, e-cigarettes use the free-base nicotine, which is the purest form of nicotine, and is also the harshest on the throat. And this is like the more traditional cigarette feel. Manufacturers like Juul, a number of years ago, found a way to reduce the harshness of the vape by turning the free-base nicotine into nicotine salt, which is nicotine that has been pH balanced. So this helps deliver a nicotine content much more quickly and makes it easier for the nicotine to be inhaled because it does lack that harshness in the throat. This also makes e-cigarettes more appealing, increases the likelihood of addiction. It also gets the nicotine to the brain much more quickly and higher concentrations. They've also added benzoic acid, a food preservative, to deliver the nicotine directly to the lungs and then the brain through the bloodstream. And I want to note that this was all intentional and very thought out by these companies. And they wanted to be able to hook users within that very first hit. The American Academy of Pediatrics observed that the first-time Juul users or of similar products became addicted within 2 months of use. And then even more recently, e-cigarette companies have started using synthetic nicotine instead of tobacco-derived nicotine. This is created in a lab, does not come from a tobacco plant, and this is done in a way to escape loopholes set by the FDA, and it has gotten less expensive to produce the synthetic nicotine. So they've shifted to using synthetic nicotine to avoid government regulation, but they've also said, hey, it's not from a tobacco plant, so we don't have to be regulated by the FDA. And then, so example, Puff Bar was ordered to remove all of their e-cigarettes from the market. So instead of doing so, they switched to synthetic nicotine. And then I do want to note that synthetic nicotine is so new, there is little research on the health effects of that. And I do also want to note that e-cigarettes in other countries are used for cessation. However, in the States, vaping is not an effective smoking cessation tool because there is little regulation on how much nicotine can be in a vaping pod. Most e-cigarettes contain nicotine. About 99% of them do, no matter what the label says. When using e-cigarettes, the nicotine stimulates the body to release adrenaline, which then triggers the central nervous system and increases blood pressure, breathing, and heart rate. And it activates the brain's reward circuits to increase dopamine. Putting nicotine in the body is dangerously addictive and can also prime the brain for addiction to other tobacco products or even harder drugs. And then using nicotine while your brain is still developing can have lifelong effects on the brain. And then as noted, there is no limit on the amount of nicotine that can be in an e-cigarette in the United States. Other countries have set limits, but not the US. So here in the US, we have Juul pods that contain 59 milligrams of nicotine per milliliter, whereas in the EU, it's 20 milligrams per milliliter, which is 3 times what is legal in the EU. So I want to talk about some quick stats about smoking, vaping, and asthma. So between early 2000s and 2021, cigarette smoking and use dropped from 23% to 2%, but vaping has quickly taken its place. So in 2020, nearly 25% of teenagers reported ever having used any tobacco products, including e-cigarettes. This equates to about 2.5 million middle and high school students nationwide who currently vape, and current usage is determined by respondents indicated they have used a tobacco product on at least one day during the past 30 days. This is about 14.1% of high schoolers and 3.3% of middle schoolers indicate current use. And this is cause for concern because when looking at asthma prevalence on the right-hand side, shows that there's a significant jump in prevalence of asthma from ages 5 and upward. And we might know this, we might not, but this is because asthma is really difficult to diagnose in young children who may display asthma symptoms, but they are explained away as other common illnesses in kids. So because of this, some kids might not be diagnosed until later on in life and not know this when they experiment with vape. Vaping is very popular, especially among youth and young adults. This is partially because of the targeted marketing tactics of big tobacco and ads that are common among social media, especially TikTok and Instagram. So, like mentioned, overall rates of traditional smoking are going down, and there are not enough people who smoke combustible tobacco products to consume at the same level. So the younger generations know the consequences of traditional smoking, and tobacco companies know that. So the companies needed to create something new that would pique the interest of younger people. This is why they're really excited about e-cigarettes. They have managed to create this product that middle school and high school students are interested in and have successfully hooked a whole new generation of smokers. People who would never have smoked a regular cigarette are suddenly using e-cigarettes and could potentially be users for decades or even a lifetime. There are approximately 400 e-cigarette brands currently available, and with flavors like banana cream, zombie blood, blueberry raz lemonade, and I love cookies too, these names really spark curiosity, and not just in kids. In February 2020, the FDA stopped allowing flavors for pod-based e-cigarettes like Juul, minus menthol, which is still allowed. But this doesn't include other e-cigarette types that don't use pods or disposable e-cigarettes. And cloud chasing is a phenomenon that shows very cool artistic exhaled aerosols and vapor that draw the interest of kids and adults alike. And I will turn it over to Rachel.
Okay, thanks, Erin. I'm going to talk a little bit about the health effects of vaping and the correlation between vaping and asthma. But before I jump into that, I do just want to provide a disclaimer. As Erin has mentioned, there is limited research on the health effects of vaping, and there's significant limitations on current studies that the following information is based on. So just to preface, so again, first, there's limited research. The second is that the current research is based on data gathered from prior years, like Erin mentioned, and the vaping marketplace is full of innovative products that are continuously changing, so it's very hard to stay on top of the research. And thirdly, research on vaping is mostly self-reported data, which already inherently has its own limitations and biases. So many of these studies and information in this presentation were gathered through conversations with Dr. Emma Brett, who's a researcher at the University of Chicago Medicine's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience, and she specializes in substance abuse. So we will speak to the health effects of vaping next, but again, want to just provide that disclaimer. And this photo here shows the CEOs of vaping companies presenting to Congress and admitting that they themselves do not know the long-term health effects of vaping. Okay, so the health effects of vaping, again, there are no long-term control studies about the risks of vaping. However, the current studies available show that vaping is not harmless. We also know the negative effects of nicotine and the effects that these can have on things like our cardiovascular system, our brains, and our lungs. And so we're going to discuss some of those health effects associated with vaping and nicotine. So nicotine affects the brain and the heart. It harms parts of the brain that controls things like attention, learning, mood, and impulse control. As Erin mentioned, nicotine is already highly addictive, but younger people are more likely to become addicted because of their developing brains. And addiction is a form of learning. So it's teaching the brain to be dependent on this substance. And because for younger people, their brains are still developing during adolescence, it's much easier for them to become addicted compared to adults. E-cigarette usage can increase the likelihood of things like panic attacks, depression, hot flashes, fainting, insomnia, slurred speech, and fatigue. And we do know that things like strong emotions can be an asthma trigger, as well as, depression, anxiety can affect how a person manages or controls their asthma as well. And vaping and nicotine also does affect the heart. It has been found that e-cigarettes and nicotine can cause arterial stiffness, impede blood flow, raise blood pressure and heart rate, all of which can lead to heart attacks and other heart-related conditions. And it's been found that overall, acute cigarette use has been associated with several toxic effects at the molecular, cellular, tissue, organ, and system levels in the body. Now we want to talk more a little more about lung damage associated with vaping. When we talk about vaping and lung damage, there's a common disease that we hear about, and it's called popcorn lung. And this is caused by a certain chemical that's found in e-liquids called diacetyl. And inhaling this causes reversible, life-threatening lung disease that causes narrowing of the airways, makes it hard to breathe, and can mimic symptoms of COPD. However, inhaling any of the ultrafine particles in the vaping liquids can cause irritation and impact overall lung health. There has been evidence that teens who use e-cigarettes are more likely to have increased coughing, wheezing, and other short-term health effects, such as asthma flares. And a longitudinal study that came out in December of 2019 showed that there's evidence that people who use e-cigarettes have an increased risk of developing chronic lung disease, including conditions such as COPD, chronic bronchitis, emphysema, or asthma. And they found that people who only use e-cigarettes had about a 30% increased risk of developing lung disease compared with people who didn't use any nicotine products. Now, to talk a little bit about the secondhand exposure to vaping and vape smoke. Many of the same chemicals inhaled into the lungs are also expelled when the user breathes the vapor out. And this includes volatile aldehydes and oxidant metals, both of which are associated with lung toxicity. Although more studies are needed to establish a causal relationship with secondhand vape exposure and the respiratory system, there was a study done in 2022 that observed an association with secondhand vaping smoke and bronchitis systems, such as cough and excess phlegm, as well as shortness of breath, after accounting for tobacco and cannabis co-exposures. So for example, they found that shortness of breath and other respiratory systems are seen in workers who have occupational exposure to that chemical diacetyl, which is that flavoring chemical found in vapes that can lead to the condition of popcorn lung. Now just talk about a little bit about common asthma triggers and their relation to combustion byproducts. Common triggers of asthma are due to combustion of chemicals, including tobacco and smoke. Gas stoves have been in the news recently, mostly in the political arenas. However, it's been known to scientists for a while that gas stoves burn natural gas that emit pollutants that irritate the airways and can cause or exacerbate respiratory problems. Other things like burning scented candles can release chemicals into the air, including toluene, which is a clear flammable liquid found in petroleum, and benzene, a compound found in the air resulting from burning coal and oil emissions. So it's clear that the heating and burning of chemicals, whether that be candles, gas, stoves, tobacco smoke, or vaping, can have a significant impact on people's lungs, even if it's secondhand in the case of smoking and vaping. So what the research says, again, while the research on the direct cause-effect relationship between vaping and asthma is limited, a few studies have found negative impacts of vaping, particularly on asthmatic individuals. Present studies suggest that even short-term e-cigarette use causes similar effects as tobacco smoke, including cellular inflammation, cell death, and oxidative stress, which is when too many free radicals are in the body and the body can't get rid of them, and DNA damage. And these effects are all drivers for respiratory diseases and respiratory conditions. E-cigarette users have an increased association with asthma and are more likely to have had days absent from school due to severe asthma symptoms. A study on the short-term respiratory effects of e-cigarette use on people without asthma found that with and without asthma found that both groups of participants experienced airway irritation after e-cigarette use. However, the asthmatic group experienced significantly increased irritation and took twice as long to recover from the exposure. Evidence that inhaling heated tobacco vapor through e-cigarettes was linked to increased odds of asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, conditions long demonstrated to be caused by traditional smoking of traditional combustible cigarettes. Another study found that teenagers exposed to secondhand vapors are 27% more likely to report an asthma attack than those that were not exposed. And it's been found that the aerosolized chemicals in the vapes immobilize immune cells called alveolar macrophages. And this is what our body uses these cells to remove asthma triggers like dust and allergens from the lungs. And so this affects the body's response once exposed to an allergen, which can make it difficult for people, especially asthmatics, to clear those toxic particles from their lungs. And challenges to research include the rapidly evolving e-cigarette technology, diversity of e-liquid composition, and the absence of standardization in e-cigarette products, all of which make it challenging to compare results across these studies, which is why it's difficult to have a lot of research in this field. So on the last slide, we did just want to provide some quit smoking resources. The Truth Initiative, This Is Quitting, is a text-based resource for kids. They can text ditch vape, and early research on this Is Quitting shows early success with almost a quarter, about 24% of intervention participants reporting vaping abstinence at 7 months. And we also have, for adults, the RHA's Courage to Quit Smoking cessation classes, which have been run for over a decade and have been instrumental in helping people quit smoking. These were designed with Dr. Andrea King at University of Chicago, and the program's effectiveness has been documented in the American Journal of Public Health. So people who vape are welcome to join these classes, and we are working with Dr. King to ensure that these programs remain effective for people who vape. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, a very good presentation and a lot to dig into. We do have a couple minutes, so if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat and we'll make sure that they get answered. I have one just to get us started. So for the regarding FDA regulation of e-cigarettes and other sort of like vaping or like nicotine products, like where do we stand on the FDA's regulation of these products, and like is there a long-term path to make sure that eventually vaping products have the same level of regulation as other sort of nicotine products?
That's a really tricky question because there are pathways, there are things the FDA is trying to do to limit these products. All the vape products now have to submit pre-market evaluation from the FDA, so the FDA has to approve it. But you know, it's kind of a mixed bag. They are approving probably about 50% of all vape products that are coming through. I don't really know like why they're approving some but not others. But other than a couple of policies that they're trying to push on flavored nicotine, there's really not a lot. And you know, there's a lot of fighting about standardizing that or how like penalizing that will lead to illegal usage and people making their own. Yeah, so that is a really tricky question, and that's something I feel is there's not a good pathway just yet, but there's a lot of legislators trying to put these policies into place to try to prevent at least youth from using it, but also adults who find these products appetizing.
And I think the tricky thing is also, just to add on, it's a constantly moving target. So when a policy is created, these companies are finding ways around it. And the same goes for marketing. And so they're really clever at staying on top and kind of moving around the current policies that are in place.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that, but Helen had a really good question. Are there courage to quit classes offered in Illinois? Are they virtual or in person? And is there any cost associated with that?
Yeah, our Courage to Quit program, we have a number of partners who do offer the Courage to Quit. It really does depend on who it is. Some of them are offered virtually. Some of them are offered in person, depending on the population. We ourselves do Courage to Quit classes for people living in the county and DuPage. But we do have partners in Southern Illinois who do Courage to Quit classes. Our website does have a list of locations that do offer Courage to Quit classes. So it's just a matter of calling them up and seeing like if it's free. We do try to ask them to provide it at low cost or free, just to prevent that barrier of entry.
Thank you. And I mean, I did want to ask just a follow-up question to the question about the FDA, which is that, you know, from an advocacy perspective, like what does a change in policy look like, or what does effective advocacy look like when there's so little research at this point and when the products are iterating so quickly? Like, is there a role that we can play in trying to like change the dynamic in Illinois? And like, are there lawmakers who are interested in seeing that happen?
Yeah, we ourselves are doing it with Cook County to try and bring legislation to commissioners to try to sign on so that we do enact a flavor ban. California has just enacted a flavor ban for products. And I think just the overall advocacy is important. So reaching out to, you know, your local, first of all, is so important, with your city council, but all the way up to federal. FDA often offers people to come and talk about vaping. So there's a number of advocacy avenues that you can take, but it's just really just getting involved from all the way from the local level all the way to federal, and just like sending in your feedback, like, hey, you should really think about banning this, because legislators are supposed to work for you, right? So you do have the ability to access people, whether or not you know it. You can meet with aides and say, hey, this is a problem. Like, what are you doing about it?
Well, I see that we're a couple minutes over time. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I want to thank Rachel and Aaron especially for a great presentation. We do have a survey. It's very short. The link was put in the chat by Asher. So if you could check that out, we'd really appreciate it. It helps us to bring up more forum topics that people want to hear about. And I think we'll end it there and just say thank you everyone for joining. For more information about the CAC, you can go to our website, chicagoasthma.org. We'll be having our in-person conference on May 2nd, and then the Lunch and Learn series will reconvene in August for another set of topics. So I hope you'll check that out, and we'll see you hopefully on May 2nd. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.